just wanted to make this video about a topic that I've been interested in for like 7 years now. I've been researching and reading a lot about predominantly Black history, but American and European history. I've been studying European and American history for about since 2008. Since 2008. So it's a minute now. Been a minute now, right? But the reason I'm doing this video, because it's my strong belief that Black people, when it comes to studying history, is like way off. They are so off. It's unbelievable, right? And I'm a person that believe that stereotypes is real. I'm not a person that take offense to stereotypes and shit like that. But at least not now. I used to, but when I was younger, way younger. But as I got older, I realized stereotypes are real. And it's one thing they said about Black people when it comes to knowledge, right? They said if you want to hide something from an N-word, a Black person, quote unquote Black person, all you gotta do is put it in a book. And that will prevent Black people from being updated with information about themselves and about their environment. Because Black people like to be entertained, including myself. Black people like to be entertained and not educated. They think education is boring. They think education is nerdy. They think their education they frown upon. But being entertained is what Black people love to. They strive to be entertained, whether it's through music, whether it's through sports, whether it's through anything that boosts their dopamine in the brain. Right? So, including myself, and over the years I had to train myself to transfer that mentality into educational mentality. So I read a lot of books, I researched Black history. And this is the confusion where Black people come to, right? Now there is a argument that's going around about Black history. Now, we know through Board of Education, through schools all over the Americas, whether in North America, South America, if you are a melanated person, if you're a quote-unquote Black person, I know that's subjective. Some melanated people say I'm not Black. Some people say we Black. Okay, whatever. I'm not talking about subjectiveness. We're going to keep things objective. So we're going to leave that for another topic. But the main point is, if you're a melanated person in the Americas and you went to some type of school, whether it's in North America, South America, or we went to a Spanish school, English school, or a French school, because that's the three main languages spoken in the Americas, right? If you were of Afro descent or quote-unquote African descent, you were taught that your family, your ancestry, started from a slave ship story. That your ancestors would have brought on ships against their will and in treacherous conditions over the ocean, over the Atlantic Ocean. And your ancestors was dropped off. And hence, from there on, you were a so-called slave to the Americas. And you were under subjugation of a political empire that beat you, that raped your kids, or your ancestors' kids, and all that shit. I mean, that's the story that we was given in a public education school. That's one side of Black historical argument. The other side is none of that, what I just described, ever happened in our history. We were not slaves. We didn't come on a slave ship. We were always here in the Americas. And our history is more than a slave story. So those are the two sides of the argument. I like to give the two sides names. One side I give Pan-African, the Pan-African point of view of black history in the Americas, and you have the Pan-American, which I term the Pan-American view of black history in the Americas. So again, the Pan-Africans say that our history as black people in the Americas came from a slave ship story, the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. The Pan-American story says, which I term Pan-American, says that no, black people were already here before Christopher Columbus came. And Christopher Columbus, along with other groups of people, gave all of us the term Indians, whether you were a Negroid Indian or an Asiatic Indian. We were all given the term Indian. I'm on the Pan-American side, so through this video, I'm going to be speaking from the point of view of the Pan-American side. Another thing I must interject with, right, is that it seems to me that black people, when we look at history, when we research history, whether you're an amateur historian or a professional historian, we seem to focus on one side of the coin. Now, we were told as kids, I know I was told as a child, that there's two sides to every story. So if it's two sides to every story, then why we as black people focus on one side of the story and not look at the other side of the story? Now, that's a whole different reasons why that we could get into in another time, but like I said, we're gonna keep things objective here. But that's sort of a rhetorical question, but think about it though. So in order for me to clarify and to really understand what happened to us, I mean black people, or let me be more specific, the African American, the Afro-Latino, and the Afro-Caribbean people of the Americas. That's who I'm speaking for and to. And that's who I classify as Pan-Americans as well. I'm going to repeat, the African American, the Afro-Latino, and the Afro-Caribbean. To me, are the American Indian people. We were classified as Indians by Columbus, and we're still here. We were never extinct. And this is the basic premise of my video right now. We all heard the Atlantic slave trade story. We are all familiar. And the keynote that a lot of Africans that I speak to, you know what I mean? I drive trucks, and my co-worker is an African guy. He's from Nigeria, I think. And I asked him, yo, they ever taught you in school about the African slave trade? He said, nah, I only know about that when I came here to the Americas. That's when I started learning about that. We never knew about no African slave trade. So I just wanted to interject with that so y'all could keep that in mind throughout the video. So, the African American, Afro-Latino, and Afro-Caribbeans are the true Pan-Americans. We were the part of the Indian population that Christopher Columbus came and saw. And we have no ties to Africa. Now, in order for me to prove this, I would have to go back in history. I would have to go back to the point of origin according to the narrative, which is the Atlantic slave trade. And that's where I had to focus on to really get to that premise to say, no, we weren't on that slave ship. We weren't on no slave ship. We were the ones that were here before Christopher Columbus came. So the Atlantic slave trade had to be challenged. The story had to be challenged and questioned. Chronology has given me the intellectual fortitude to question these narratives. And this brings me to a great author that I consider a great author, researcher, Anatoly Fomenko. Now, the 30 plus year research that man has done, he's a Russian, by the way. He's a Russian mathematician, by the way, and he studies celestial movements of the stars. So he's an astronomer, right? So he's a mathematician and astronomer. And his whole 30 plus year research was based on timelines, time periods, time itself, how time works, and how do we use time to pinpoint accurate historical events, whether it's recorded in books or we have anthropological artifacts, paleontological artifacts, and so on and so forth, of the other sciences that help people to research history. Excuse me, right? So his research basically attached real timelines to real historical events. And let me interject here again. This is one of the reasons why a large amount of secular people say the Bible is fake, the Torah is fake, the Quran is fake. Like it's not real, it's just mythology mostly, and so on and so forth. Anatoly Fomenko's research had me consider that narrative and challenge that narrative. They say, no, I do believe events in the Bible are real, right? It's told in a allegorical manner, metaphorical manner, but it's still tied to real events. And not just the Bible, but the Torah, and the Quran. Right? All three books have historical truth in it. The reason why we can't tie those real characters in those scriptures, recorded scriptures of history, is because we were looking in the wrong timeline. Like the timeline that we were given through public education doesn't match the timeline in historical records. So, for example, we'll think King Solomon. King Solomon is a character in the Bible, for those who don't know, right? People think King Solomon is just a mythological king. That didn't really exist. It's just, but Anatoly Fomenko's research proves that, yeah, he did exist. He was a real king. But we thinking that King Solomon was based in what, 1500 AD? I mean BC, when really King Solomon was in the 12th century AD, not 12th century BC. Right? So King Solomon could be Sultan Suleiman, which a lot of people say, yeah, that it was the real King Solomon. Sultan Suleiman, right? And that's just one of many examples. Anatoly Fomenko also brought me to what I'm about to discuss. It's along with me clarifying that, again, the African Americans, Afro-Latino, and Afro-Caribbeans are the real American Indians and has no ties from Africa, right? As far as culturally, and I can't say genetically. I'm not gonna say, but at least culturally and landmass wise, we're not from Africa. We have no African ties, right? We are American, and it's my reason for this video to explain to people that we have to take the African off our ethnical identity. So, for example, if you are if you were a melanated black person, family, born in the U.S., been in the U.S. for generations, you need to take the African off the American. So the term African American, get rid of the African and just use American. Same with the Caribbean. If there's an African Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean, you need to take the Afro or the African off the Caribbean and only use Caribbean if you're from the Caribbean for generations. If your family is Afro-Latino and your family was in South America for generations, you need to take the Afro from the Latino and just strictly call yourself Latino. You have no African ties. Again, Anatoly Fomenko, the great one, he wrote all his works. It's incredible. He influences other scholars to use his research to create their perspectives on history and to prove it. Not just create it, but prove that what they're creating is stands on truth. His work influenced me to think about the Atlantic slave trade. And one of my major points to my argument is the Atlantic slave trade is also equal to the Arab slave trade. I'm gonna say again, the Atlantic slave trade was identical, same event as the Arab slave trade. They were one and the same thing. They were just given two different names to confuse the population. All right, what do I mean? Okay. Now, the Atlantic slave trade, again, I said, we know the narrative. We all know the narrative. But we really don't, a lot of us don't understand the narrative of the Arab slave trade. So they say the Arab slave trade started in 700 AD and it lasted for 1,300 years. That's the narrative. Again, the Arab slave trade started in 700 AD and lasted for 1,300 years. That is the actual general narrative of the Arab slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade, they said, started in the 15th century and ended in the 18th century. Right? The one thing I noticed between those two narratives is one overlaps the other. One overlaps the other. The Arab slave trade was 1,300 years. So from 700 AD plus 13, that's year 2000. That's all the way up from 700 AD all the way up to the year 2000. That's the narrative. Now we know that slave trade wasn't, or was it? And then you look at the Atlantic slave trade time period, the Arab slave trade overlaps, or basically it will prove that the Atlantic slave trade was either the Arab slave trade or at the least a continuation of the Arab slave trade. Now, that argument drives me to pose a question. Who were the actual people on these slave trade voyages? Both the Arab and the Atlantic slave trade. Because if they overlap each other, and at the very least one is a continuation of the other, then the same group of people that were on the first of the starting point, which is the Arab slave trade, should be the same people that was in the Atlantic slave trade. As far as ethnical group, who were the ethnical group of people on both slave trade voyages, according to the narrative? And this is why I say Anatoly Fomenko's research has given me the intellectual fortitude to question these narratives. So, Atlantic slave trade, in my opinion, in my perspective, not even an opinion, but researched perspective, suggests that the Arab slave trade and the Atlantic slave trade is not only one and the same slave trade voyage, but carried the same group of people, which were not melanated, quote unquote, black people, Negro. I'm gonna say again, they were not melanated people. They were Europeans. I'm gonna say that again. Not only is the Arab slave trade the same as the Atlantic slave trade, the people that were carried over suggested by the narrative were not, quote unquote, black people as we know them today. They were Slavic, Eastern Europeans, Circassians, Mamluks, Arabs, Polish Europeans, which was a part of the Transportation Act of 1717. And that's my argument. Now, how are you gonna prove this, bro? Well, two different ways I could prove this, right? Matter of fact, three different ways, right? We could use etymology to define the ethnic classifications that quote unquote black people fell under for the last since the since the since the landing of Christopher Columbus to the New World all the way up to now. African Americans, Afro Caribbeans, and Afro Latinos, we were given multiple names over the last 400 years. First, we were called Indians by Christopher Columbus. Then we were called Negro. Then we were called African in 1782. Supposedly, this is narratives I'm giving y'all. This is not my belief. I'm giving y'all the official public narrative of Black history. African in 1782. Then we were termed colored. Then we were given black. Now we were all given the terms African American, Afro Caribbean, and Afro Latino. So at least four to five different classifications we were given as a people, and we were the only group of people. The Chinese weren't given 5 different names. The Germans, the Italians, the Irish, they weren't given 5 different names for over 400 years. The Spanish, the French, they weren't given 5. Only, quote unquote, black people, we were the only group of people that were given 5 different classifications legally under political subjugation. This was enforced by laws. There were laws that were with these names to substantiate the identity, ethnic identity we were given by the powers that be. And this is a dilemma. This should raise questions like, why were we given 5 different names? All 5 names are misnomers. Negro is a misnomer. No, the reason why Negro is a misnomer because Negro was an adjective. Negro had a small n, not a capital N, and that's how you know the difference between nouns, verbs, adjectives. Only nouns have capital letters in front of the word. Adjectives, they created adjectives into nouns. So Negro was an adjective. It became a noun later in the 17th century, 16th century, or late 16th, 17th century. Right? It was used as a description, not a name of a person, place, or thing, which is a noun. An adjective is a word that's used to describe things. A noun is a name that's given to things to classify them. So again, they use Negro, which is an adjective. The word black is an adjective. Africa is not an adjective, it is a noun. But it's the wrong noun because it's the wrong landmass. So it's still a misnomer. Right? So Negro is an adjective. The word black is an adjective. The word colored is an adjective. Right? The term Africa is a noun, but it's still a misnomer because you're giving the people in America the wrong name of the location they're from. So that's a misnomer. So now we have 4 misnomers. But the word Indian and the word American are not misnomers. They are actually the terms that were given to us that accurately described us. ethnically described us. Now, like I said, adjectives are words that describe us. So I'm talking about nouns, not adjectives. So nouns describe us too, but just by a term, not necessarily a whole paragraph or full of a description. You know what I mean? So again, noun, you have to know the difference between nouns and adjectives, right? So etymology is the first thing that could prove this, right? And then I have historical records to prove this as well, right? Through Anatoly Fomenko, right? So I just use etymology to prove the first point of the misclassifications of black people in the Americas, whether North, Central, and South, right? So now, I'm about to just, I'm going to my other phone, and we're going to bring up, right? So this is Anatoly Fomenko's books. See, he has pictures. I'm going to be reading from this for like 2 seconds. Now, I want to... This is the chapter. It says, the problem of historical chronology. And I briefly describe what chronology is. It's basically attaching real time periods to real historical events and historical records to get an accurate description of history. Right? This is chapter 1, the problems of historical chronology. I'm just going to pick a paragraph here. It says, Scaliger, Petavius, and other clerical chronologers, the creation of contemporary chronology of the ancient times in the 15th, 13th, and between the 13th and the 17th century. The chronology of ancient and medieval history in its present form had been created and for the most part concluded in a series of fundamental works of the 16th and the 17th century that begins with the writings of Josephus Justus Scaliger, called the founder of modern chronology as a science by the modern chronologist E. Bickerman, page 82. This is a medieval portrait. He has portraits of who Joseph Scaliger is and the chronologist, right? Let us mention the words of century which contain a great array of factual chronological data, such he gives pages and of references. They are of great value to us since they provide a snapshot of the state of chronology during the epoch of greater proximity to Scaliger and Petavius. This material is thus of a more primordial nature, not painted over by latter cosmetic layers. It must be noted that these series remains incomplete as well as several other similar chronological works. To quote the prominent contemporary chronologist E. Bickerman, there has been no chronological research ever conducted that could be called exhaustive and conforming to modern standards. Hence, it would be correct to call the modern consensual chronology of the classical period. In the Middle Ages, the Scaliger-Petavius version, we shall simply refer to it as a Scaligerian chronology. As will be pointed out, this version wasn't the only existing in the 15th and to the 17th century. Its veracity has been questioned by eminent scientists. The ground-laying works of Scaliger and Petavius of the 15th to the 17th century present the ancient chronology as a table of dates given without any reasons whatsoever. It is declared to have been based on ecclesiastical tradition. This is hardly surprising since history has remained predominantly ecclesial ecclesial for centuries, and for the most part was written by the clergy. The clergy talking about the church. Today, it is believed that foundations of chronology were laid by Eusebius, Pamphilus, and Saint Hieronymus, allegedly in the fifth century A.D. We have a medieval painting of Eusebius Pamphilus of Caesarea dated 1455. It is worth noting that Eusebius of Caesarea is painted in typically medieval attire of the Renaissance epoch, most probably because he lived in that period of time and not any earlier. Despite the fact that the Scaliger history ascribes Eusebius to be the 5th century AD, during the years 260 to 340, well, the 4th century AD, it is interesting to note that his famous work titled The History of Time from the Genesis to the Nicene Council, the so-called Chronicle, as well as the tractate by Saint Hieronymus or Saint Jerome, weren't discovered until very late in the Middle Ages. Apart from that, historians say that the Greek origin of Eusebius is only available in fragmentary form nowadays and is complemented by the ad libitum translation made by Saint Hieronymus or Saint Jerome. Mark the fact that Nicephorus Callistus attempted to write the new history of the first 3 centuries in the 14th century, or revise the history of Eusebius, but he could not do more than repeat which has written by Eusebius. However, since the work of Eusebius was only published in 1544, that is much later than the writing of Nicephorus. One has to reason to wonder, could the ancient Eusebius have based his work on medieval tractate by Nicephorus Callistus? So basically what he's saying here is that these historical chronologists like Scaliger and Petavius and all these other Greek ancient scholars, they basically weren't born in the time period that they said they were born in. And they also wrote historical content, not in the time period that they said they were, but in medieval history that's like 1,000 years later. So basically they misinterpreted and they basically switched the time periods around. They added 1,000 years to a time period that never existed. And these people that we think was in like 1500 AD, BC and 1200 BC and 500 BC and all this other shit. These people, these real historical people were not in that time period, but in a 1,000-year later time period, in a Renaissance history, medieval history. The whole Bible was written about Italian, European Renaissance history. You know what I mean? So it's basically telling you that the time period is fucked up. History has been fabricated. There are a lot of exaggerations and things flipped around that weren't real. I'm gonna move on to the chapter where he spoke about radiocarbon dating is actually a fugazi science. Like it's basically inaccurate, right? Let me just move on. But it's just an example to show you that history that we know it's not real. It's not real. It is real, but it's not what you think it is. You have to really put your thinking cap on. You got to connect dots. You got to basically compare and contrast all throughout history to really get the exact person that they're talking about. Because you will believe, if you go by what they say, you're going to believe that a certain character in history was in this period when they was really in this period. You know? And people like Joseph Scaliger was basically one of, he wasn't the only person, but he was one of most pioneers of distorting history. You know, look, and this is page 74 in the book History, Fiction, or Science, which is written by Anatoly Fomenko. I'm gonna read, and this is I'm reading from right here. Are radiocarbon datings to be trusted? The radiocarbon datings of ancient, medieval, and modern specimens are scattered chaotically. Libby's initial idea, the first failures. The most popular method claiming the capability of dating ancient artifacts independently is the radiocarbon method. However, the accumulation of the radiocarbon datings has exposed the difficulty of the method's application. According to Oleynikov, another problem had to be considered. The intensity of the atmospheric radiation is affected by many cosmic factors. The radioactive carbon isotope production rate should also vary, and one needs to find a method that would consider these variations. Apart from that, over the period when highways and industrial plants have been introduced by the civilization, a gigantic amount of carbon from the combustion of wood, coal, oil, turf, oil shales, and their products emanated into the atmosphere. How does this atmospheric carbon affect the production of its radioactive isotope carbon-14, which is where they get the radiocarbon dating specimen from, that type of carbon. Isotope basically is just the different variations of an element. So, in order, continuing, how does this atmospheric carbon affect the production of its radioactive isotope? In order to get veracious datings, one has to introduce complex corrections into calculations that reflect the changes in the content of the atmosphere over the last millennium. This issue, as well as a number of technical difficulties, cast a shadow of doubt over the precision of many radiocarbon datings. Basically, the method that they use, which is radiocarbon dating, to give you dates on artifacts, historical events, and all this other craziness, is highly inaccurate. And it's a false method to use to date things in history. All right? So they will find a couple pots in Colombia somewhere and say, oh, this is what the pots they use to cook food and shit. Right? And then they they'll use those same artifacts and put it on a radiocarbon dating method. Not knowing, they know this. These people they know that this is an erroneous method, but they're still gonna tell the public that it's true and it's real. So the people gonna believe, oh, they got shit that they say is 50,000 years old. Whole time it's probably like 500 years old. So, and this is just brief, this is nothing compared to what this man has written. Another chapter about radiocarbon dating, right? Hold on. Just going to read from here. Anatoly Fomenko's book, History, Fact, or Fiction, or History. They renamed it. Now, when I saw this book, it was on an infomercial on a late night, about 2 o'clock in the morning. They never put this book on like daytime TV commercials and shit. It's always nighttime because they know people, especially black people, we sleep by it. Or we in a club somewhere. We ain't paying attention to nothing educational at 2 o'clock in the morning. So this is how they could sneak past information. You know what I mean? But they had the first, I believe, unless it's a Mandela effect, but I believe the first name of the book, when I saw it, this was like 2010 or something. History, Fact, or Fiction. Now it's termed History, Fiction, or Science. Same book, same information, just different title. So we're going to read about the criticism of the application of radiocarbon method to historical specimens. According to Ellis Klein, the radiocarbon datings have confused the archaeologists greatly. Some of them were characteristically overzealous to follow the advice of the physicists. These archaeological hasten to reconstruct the chronological schemes, which implies they aren't constructed firmly enough. The first archaeologist to have opposed the radiocarbon method was Vladimir Milojic, whatever, who attacked the practical usage of radiocarbon dating as well as criticizing the very theoretical foundation of the physical method sharply and bitterly. The comparison of the individual measurements of modern specimens with their average value allowed Milojic to support this skepticism with a series of brilliant paradoxes. The shell of a living American mollusk has the radioactivity index of 13.8 as compared to the average value of 15.3, which makes it 1,200 years old. A live North African wild rose flower with a radioactivity of 14.7 has been dead for 360 years, according to physicists. As for the Australian eucalyptus with a radioactivity of 16.31, it isn't likely to exist anywhere in the next 600 years. A shell from Florida with a value of 17.4 shall only appear in 1,080 years. Since in the past radioactivity hasn't been spread any more evenly than it is now, similar fluctuations and errors may afflict ancient objects as well. See? So they've given examples of how these radiocarbon methods are erroneous and is never consistent. It fluctuates, it's volatile. You can't get an accurate conclusion of an experiment with fluctuated results. So those are just a couple examples to show you that history has been tampered with. History is not, you have to use your thinking cap when you're researching history. You can't, it's one of those subjects that you can't just, you can't just believe what you've been told. You have to examine, you have to analyze, you have to challenge premises, you have to challenge hypotheses. You have to challenge theories. You have to challenge them. You have to challenge them. You can't just believe shit. So this is what brings me to the point of black people believing that their history started from a slave trade story. If they could lie about radiocarbon dating, what else do you think they lying about? What else you think they lying about? You think that the slave trade story that they recorded in contemporary books is the actual story of your history? You must be fucking stupid if you believe that. So, it's going to be my last part to this rant, right? So, Anatoly Fomenko's research brought me to my conclusion, which is, like I stated before, the African slave trade is the Arab slave trade. It's one and the same. The one thing that was consistent with both those stories is they brought people over. The question is, who were these people? Were these people African that became our ancestors? Or were they a complete different groups of people that became some other group's ancestors? That's not us. Like I said, the Arab slave trade is the Atlantic slave trade. The Arab slave trade people that they say mostly were Slavic people that were slaves in that story. That's the narrative. Slavic people. And it's interesting that the word Slav or the word Slavic is the original word of the word slave. I'm going to say again, the word Slavic or the word Slav is the older or the birth or the original word that the word slave comes from. Ironically, so conveniently that the two words are basically the same mother and daughter words. The mother word is Slav or Slavic, and the daughter word is slave. So who were these Slavics? Who were these so-called slaves that came on these slave trade voyages? They were Europeans. They weren't melanated people. Well, I'm not gonna say all of them. They were probably was some black people on those ships. I'm pretty sure they were. But were they enough black people to say to basically birth a whole new generation and a whole new landmass? I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. I seriously doubt it. So it's my strong opinion that any black person walking around in 2025 still believing that their ancestry are slaves, and they came on a slave ship, and that's where your heritage started, you're an idiot. You're an idiot. Respectfully, but you're an idiot. And I hope and pray that you investigate that narrative. You read books about that narrative, and you try to figure it out. Question everything. Question them in everything. So the Arab slave trade brought Slavic people, European people, over from Europe through Africa all the way to the Americas. And this is where we get most of your Polish people, your Middle Eastern people, even a lot of Germans came on that transportation, and British and French and Spanish. The Arab slave trade is the Atlantic slave trade, and it's just a continuation of one of the other. And it was the same group of people, all Slavs, all Europe, not all, mostly Europeans, mostly Slavs, mostly Russians, mostly French, Spanish, Italians, especially the ones that were exiled out of Europe. Because a lot of people got kicked out of Europe. And these were the people that got on those ships and came here, not us as black people, because we were already here. And we were the American Indians that now they term us African American, African Caribbean, and Afro Latinos. Anatoly Fomenko research brought me to that conclusion. And I think it's substantiated by evidence. And I just gave y'all two examples of how I came to my conclusion. But I have many more examples, right? And I'm going to read those examples off for you to close out, right? And I want y'all to take these sources, research them, and see, prove me wrong. I have a list of all the argument, history debate about Aboriginal American Indians. My argument, we are the Aboriginal Indians of the Americas, Afro-American plus Afro-Caribbean plus Afro-Latino, and we are referred to as the West Indians, Pan-Americans, Red Indians, Maroons, Americans, Caribs, Tainos, Arawaks, Seminole, Shinnecock, Yamasee, Cairo Indians, plus European blood and European and Asiatic blood, and so on and so forth. We are the people who Columbus labeled Indians. My second argument to that topic is the Arab slave trade equals the Atlantic slave trade, which I just explained. Sources and books. I have over 14 books and sources I'm going to read it out to you. And you can, if y'all want to check out my sources and stuff like that, y'all could. My first book is History of West Indies, 1899 by Amos Kidder Fisk. And I'll put some pages down, page 24, page 15, and page 25. I'm going to repeat. The book title is History of the West Indies, published in 1899 by Amos Kidder, Kidder Fisk. Fisk. Page 24, page 15, and page 25. Second book is Black Laws Dictionary, fourth edition. That's a official legal dictionary that even lawyers go look to find definitions of words. Number three, Anatoly Fomenko's books. I just read out from one. I read from one. History, Fiction, or Science by Anatoly Fomenko. Please get that book. Out of all these books I'm giving you, make sure you don't get none. Get that one. This is the book I really want you. Anatoly Fomenko's book, History, Fact, or Science. It used to be called History, Fact, or Fiction. Now it's called History, Fiction, or Science. I'm sorry, History, Fiction, or Science. My fourth book, the title is Probable Origins of the American Indians, published in 1854 by James Kennedy Esquire. And that's a beautiful book. I love that book. Number five, one of my favorite personal books of all time, called Races of Men by Dr. Robert Knox. Title is Races of Men by Dr. Robert Knox. Published in 1850, and these are the pages I want y'all to really pay attention to. Page 52 to 53, from 53 to, page 52 to 60, page 75 to 80, page 81, page 145, page 148 to 153, page 165 to 172. My sixth book title is Aborigines of the West Indies by Frederick Bauer, 1894, page 15 to 20. I'm going to repeat that. Aborigines of the West Indies by Frederick Bauer, Boer, published in 1894, page 15 to 20. The seventh book is called The Terms Negro Used for Black to Describe American Indians by Jack D. Forbes. That's the title of the book. It's a long title. I'm gonna repeat that. The title is The Terms Negro Used for Black to Describe American Indians by Jack D. Forbes. My number 8th book is Story of Lemuria by Walter Scott, page 22 to 26. I'm going to repeat that. The Story of Lemuria by Walter Scott, page 22 to 26. I think that book was published in the early 1910s or 1905. 1910s, I think. I didn't put the publishing date down. I don't know why, but I probably forgot. But get that book. That's a beautiful book as well. I think one more, number 9. Ninth book is America's Place in Mythology by Alexander McCallan, published in 1934. I'm going to repeat that. The title of the book is America's Place in Mythology by Alexander McCallan, published in 1934. And that book is basically telling you that they say the narrative they say is, nobody knew about the Americas before Europeans. That's bullshit. Chinese knew about Europeans. Indians, Persians knew about ancient Greeks knew about America. Persians knew about America, and the Chinese way before the Europeans even thought about us. Right? I think the 10th book is, I'm on number 10, right? 10 or 11, right? The next book is Last of the Arawaks by Frederick Bauer again, published in 1901. It's a good book. It will give you a lot of information of the Negroid Indians and the Americans, what they look like, and so on and so forth. Next book the title is called Sunderland Greatest Emancipation Article on White Slaves by Willard Sunderland. Now, this is the book that's going to show you how the Slavs or the Eastern Europeans were slaves. They were slaves. White people were slaves. White people had slavery. Every race on the planet had slavery, including white people. Matter of fact, they done went through some shit in their slavery. Hence, they were given the term Slavs because of the word slave, because they were slaves. And this article is going to prove that. The next book is Queen Mu and the Egyptian Sphinx by Auguste Pleleon. He's a French dude, I think. And this was published in the 1900s. I'm going to repeat that title. The title of the book is called Queen Mu and the Egyptian Sphinx by Auguste Pleleon, published in the 1900s. The funny title about this book is called The Egyptian Sphinx. It might make you think that, oh, they talking about Africa. The whole book is about America, nothing about Africa. But it's titled The Egyptian Sphinx to make you believe that the book is about Africa. It has nothing to do with Africa. It has everything to do with America. Another article or book, the title is called Restore Myths of the Spanish Inquisition to the Americas, page 9. This book is basically telling you all the false narratives about the conquistador or the Columbus or the explorers that came to the New World, or the myths that were told, or the lies that were told to make you believe one thing. That's a good book to reference. The next book is History of the Indians, North and South America by C. Rand, R-A-N-D. His last name is R-A-N-D, published in 1855. Next book is Negro Laws of South Carolina, published in 1848, page 5. I'm going to repeat that title. It's called Negroes Laws of South Carolina, 1848, by page 5. The next book is Studies in Jamaican History by Frank Kundal. Last name spelled C-U-N-D-A-L-L. I'm going to repeat the title. Studies in Jamaican History, 1900 published in 1900 by Frank Kundal. C-U-N-D-A-L-L, page 2 and page 3. So I'm giving you pages and everything on some of these books so you ain't got to waste your time, right? The last book, American Nations by C.S. Rafinsky. He was a French polymath back in the late 1800s. His last name is spelled Rafinsque. The book was published in 1836, 30 years before the Civil War. This is a great book as well. So all those books I gave y'all to really research and look up and just like prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. And like I said, if any, I'm gonna make another video to really go through. I'm gonna go through 2 Anatoly Fomenko's books in these videos. Like I said, the first one is History Fiction of Science, and the second book we're gonna go through in my next video for Anatoly Fomenko is History Fiction of Science: The Issue of Antiquity by Anatoly Fomenko. Right, so there's like a series in the same title but different series in the books. It's like an encyclopedia type. But we're gonna go through these 2 books in my next video. It's gonna be a long one because a lot of information. If you wanna know, this is the book here we're gonna go through for Anatoly Fomenko, and we're gonna also go through this book right here. And this is when we go through those books, it's gonna really show you why I'm telling you that Black history is not being told. It's not accurate how we wanted to believe it. Trust me, it is not. So, y'all look out for my next 2 videos, man. Appreciate y'all giving me an opportunity to preach. Y'all have a blessed day.